Welcome back, everyone. I wanted to share this one. It's a bit different. Today, June 6th, 2019, is the 75th anniversary of the Normandy invasion on D-Day, Operation Overlord. I had two great-uncles take part in this, my great-uncle Coleman and my great-uncle Roland. My great-uncle Raymond was in the North Sea in the Navy, and my grandfather, Charles, was in Italy as a military policeman. But Roland and Coleman, they were there. Roland as a paratrooper, Coleman as a tank commander, actually storming the beach. And this is actually something that, I've talked about this, and I joke about this, that I like to ruin movies. For example, there is no cliff at Thermopylae that we saw in 300. It's a beach. My dad does it to railroad films, my mother does it to airline films, I do it to firefighter films as well. But, Saving Private Ryan got it right. Saving Private Ryan was brutal for me. Knowing my great uncles had been there, I honestly didn't make it through the beach landing the first time I saw it. I had to leave the theater. And I waited until I heard calm conversation, went back in and watched the rest of the movie. I can tell you the scene at the end was hard for me as well, but not as hard because I didn't know if Coleman faced anything like that again. I knew he was at Normandy. But looking at this invasion, what you want to realize is this is something that is very, very much common in war. You'll have months upon months upon months of planning. You'll have contingencies. You'll have all of this go in for a few hours. Part of the planning for Normandy was actually Patton's Coast Army as well, that we were very ingenious in allowing the code breakers in Germany to learn of this ghost army that was going to scale the cliffs and attack from the flank, splitting the German forces. It's probably one of the reasons our casualties weren't double what they were. But you can see it starts right at about midnight, at 07. The sentries spot the low-flying aircraft just north of Carentan on the Cotentin Peninsula. The first Pathfinders jump onto the Cotentin to mark parachute zones 3 minutes later. German paratroopers 4 minutes later of the 13th Company report the presence of enemy paratroopers. At 16 after midnight, you have the first of 3 British gliders land 50 meters from the bridge at Benouville. And Merville's German battery is attacked at the same time by the 5 Avro Lancasters, bombers of the 7th Squadron of the RAF. A minute later, you have 3 British gliders land near the bridge of the Pegasus Bridge. A minute later, 3 horse gliders. 2 minutes later, 6 Albemarle aircraft drop 60 Pathfinders from the 22nd Independent Parachute Company on drop zones NV and K east of Orne. Major Howard and his men storm Pegasus Bridge at Odark 21. Odark 30. Oberlieutenant Brandenberger, commanding the 5th Battalion of the 125th Mechanized Infantry Regiment, reports to Regimental Command that he's observing airborne operation to the east of the Orne River. 110 bombers attack the anti-aircraft batteries in the Caen-Carpiquet area. Odark 35, 2 Horsa gliders near the Rainville Bridge. Odark 40, Corporal Emile Bertard, member of the 4th French paratroopers, is shot dead at Moulin de Plumelec in Brittany. Odark 45, German reports indicating the presence of enemy paratroopers. Odark 50, 5th Brigade of the 6th British Airborne Division, commanded by General Niger Poet, is dropped near Ranville. 1 a.m., the raiders of the German Navy signal an important armada in front of the Pas de Calais. And a German sergeant discovers the Allied armada off its western 62 strong point, Omaha Beach, for the Allies. This goes on and on. Okay, and it's that fast-paced. I am going to link to the ddayoverlord.com website that I'm getting my timeline from, because as much as I studied this, I'm not going to remember all of this. But you can see how fast-paced that something that took months upon months to plan went. Then we get to the landing, and my great uncle and I, during my senior year of high school, this would have been the 94-95 school year, we sat for a day at his home, and I talked to him about his youth and his military service. I wasn't there just for D-Day. I was there for everything, and I learned more in about 9 hours with him than I did in 3 years of high school history. He talked about being drafted and going to boot camp, making friends with people he likely would have never met, going through all of that training, and eventually becoming a member of the tank division. He talks about when he got to North Africa to fight against Rommel and his Panzer divisions. And he had a bullet in one of his legs from that encounter until the day he died. Talks about when he talked about being in camp and somewhat relaxed, and the pranks they would pull. The guys would all want a photo, so the guy with the camera, they'd keep telling him, back up, no, back up, further, 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 and he'd fall in a hole that used to be a latrine. Don't know how that's a prank, but he thought it was hilarious. But then we got to D-Day, and that's when I learned about my great uncle Roland. You see, Coleman was my great uncle by marriage. His wife, my great aunt Frankie, and my grandmother were sisters. Roland was my grandfather's brother, but they all knew each other. They were all from the same area, and he talked about the paratroopers and basically those boys being scattered and not landing together like they were supposed to. Those who did land with a few people were still vastly outnumbered, outmanned, outgunned. And Roland fell on 8 June 44, 2 days after the landing. So he was obviously really in a bad spot when he landed. But then Coleman talks about that morning. And you can see in this picture, you see the ships. This is the troop carrier. But he was on a tank, and he drove his tank onto the beach. He had a bullet in his other leg from Normandy. He was at Dog 1. And he talked about hearing the bullets hitting the people outside, hearing their screams. For those of you who've seen Private Ryan, which I probably would say most of you over the age of about 16, you know that beach landing was heart-wrenching. You have people crying for their mother. You have the wounded walking around looking to pick up their limbs. You have the doctor screaming as the person he thinks he's just finally stabilized is shot. You have just the absolute chaos of that morning. And he talks about how he knew his job was to drive that tank onto the beach, and he did. And ultimately, right about a year later, he drove that tank into Buchenwald. As the Red Army liberated Auschwitz, he was part of the team that rode into Buchenwald and liberated that concentration camp. And talking to him that day, you could see at different times his eyes would light up differently. He was remembering the prank, and his eyes would light up, and he's full of life, and he's smiling. Then he remembered something else, and his eyes get just a bit shadowed, and he's remembering something that's very difficult for him, and he's talking about something he hasn't talked about before. This man is a double Purple Heart recipient, or was. He passed away in the late 90s. And this is something that is very near and dear to me for a couple of reasons. The first, of course, my family was greatly involved in this. My grandfather actually went AWOL to marry my grandmother and ran right back. So he was gone long enough to get married and then go back to base to deploy. And that's actually not as uncommon as you think in that time, because they knew they were going to fight the biggest war we'd ever been in, and there was a chance they wouldn't come home. So he wanted my grandmother to be taken care of. Coleman was already married, being just a tiny bit older than my grandfather. But Had my grandfather not been a military policeman, had he been Normandy, my mother might not have ever been born. And they went. My grandfather resented being drafted. He didn't resent serving, he resented not having a choice. But he still went. He knew there was a cause. And he went and he came home and he drove trucks for 33 years and he retired and he raised a family. Coleman worked for 30 odd more years, retired, raised a family, lost his son, and ultimately was there to tell me firsthand what happened in World War II. And it's close to me for a couple of other reasons. One, history is not being taught the way it was just 20 years ago. Social sciences really isn't. You now have children graduating high school not knowing what's in the Constitution, not knowing about pivotal historical moments, or being taught completely wrong about them. But also, look at this picture. You can see there are 9 men standing on the front row, commemorating this day 75 years later. If you figure they were all as the youngest they could be, they're all in their 90s if they lied about their age and said they were 18 when they were 16. If they were 18, they're pushing 95. And you got to figure that gentleman front and center, the 2 gentlemen on the far right, I would bet we've got at least one, if not more than one, 100-plus-year-old soldier here. We're losing a generation of people. We're losing the greatest generation. And there are organizations like the National World War II Museum in Louisiana, and Gary Sinise does a lot of work with them to bring these gentlemen to that museum that are trying to preserve the history, but we're losing them faster and faster now because, of course, they're approaching extreme old age and they lived through hell. And this is something I don't want to glorify like war. I mean, Patton himself said it, war is hell. But we need to remember what happened, and we need to remember how it happened, not the spin. And that way, when we start getting just an inkling that it might be happening again, we kind of go, wait a minute, no. We know what happened 75 years ago, and we don't want to do that again. But we also need to know what happened so that when the spin is brought out, we can say, no, that's not what's happening now. This is actually what's happening now, and it's not what you're saying. Because if all we remember is the spin, we're going to walk right back into these things. If we don't remember anything, we're going to walk right back into these things. Those who do not learn from history and from properly taught history are doomed to repeat it. And sadly, those of us who do properly learn history are doomed to be dragged along by those people, kicking and screaming the whole way. But that's my D-Day story. Coleman was he was a gruff man. He lost a son when his son was a teenager, and he lived a hard life. But he lived a life that was always driven. He always had a purpose, and he accomplished it. And that's definitely something we could learn from today. But you guys, share your stories. Do you have someone in your family that was World War II? Maybe someone that was at D-Day. Sadly, there's no way for me to find out if they served with Coleman anymore because he's not here and I don't have his records. But tell your story. Let me know in the comments about your own World War II story, your own D-Day story, and let's keep the memories alive a little bit longer. Thank you for listening to me ramble for 15 minutes. And I would definitely appreciate it if you would subscribe so that you're going to stay up to date on these. I want to do more videos like this where it's not me reacting to a news story, but it's me telling the story, where it's me talking about history, which is my passion. It's what I love to study. That's what I love to talk about. So Yeah, I mean, definitely subscribe so that you're here for the next one. Until next time, you guys have as good a day as you can. Remember those who gave everything that day 75 years ago and what they gave it for. God bless.